Hello, everybody. I am so excited to have Erin Kerry here of Sparking Wholeness. Erin is a certified integrated nutrition health coach and self-proclaimed brain health nerd. She has received training from the Institute from Integrative Nutrition and the School of Applied Functional Medicine. She is the owner of Sparking Wholeness and works as an integrative health coach at Living Well Holistic Counseling and Wellness in Tyler, Texas. As a survivor of mental illness, Erin knows firsthand how suffering from a chronic illness can infiltrate every area of our life. She has spent the last decade learning what holistic health truly means, and that comes from in the form of nutrition for mind, body, and soul. Erin wants people to be empowered to be their own health advocate and not be limited by a label or a diagnosis. Erin, thank you so much for being here today. And no, I love just everything that you shared because there are those things that do work very immediately because they're available at the brain blood uh, level, right? So they get into the cells really quickly. And the molecular size of some of those nutrients is able to cross the blood-brain barrier. Not all of the ones that you shared, but there is
Yeah.
it's not having to bypass that blood-brain barrier with as much difficulty, which is why we get that instant relief. And then you're not having to deal with the side effects of getting off of the antidepressants. Now, one of the things, just because I have a lot of people come to me that are like, I'm on this thing, I want to get off, I don't know if it's possible, that we talk about, and I know that you have talked about, is really addressing the reasons why they're feeling the way that they're feeling, meaning that we're looking at infections, right? We're looking at how the gut brain
Mhm.
connection is doing. We're looking at emotional trauma, physical trauma. We're looking at, what's their vagal nerve tone, even like, I know that mine is not great right now. And so I'm really working on that in a way that I have not ever done before. And it's
Mhm.
been fascinating because it's just another piece of that puzzle of the beauty of how God made us so with so much complexity. Um,
Yes.
but at the same time, my general recommendation, and again, this is not medical advice, but it is if you are going to go off medication, you want to make sure that you have built up the building blocks to fill in the gaps so that
Yes.
when you go off, your brain isn't like, we don't have any of the nutrients to build this serotonin house, like for lack of a better
Mhm.
analogy.
Yeah,
You
I love
have
it.
to
Yeah.
have you have to have them. And it took me, crashing postpartum, having really bad postpartum anxiety, insomnia, panic attacks, depression, that was in part hormonal before we were actually able to even figure out, like, I actually have a couple genetic things that pyroluria is one that's a little bit less
Oh,
it's
yeah.
it's known, but it's not, I mean, the doctors aren't really readily testing for it. Basically,
Right.
like my body binds up the B vitamins and zinc and just pees them out. And so I have to take it
Mhm.
regularly so that it's free circulating in my blood for my brain to actually use. I felt different within 2 hours of taking those supplements. I was like, is
Wow.
this what? And that's how you can tell there's a nutrient deficiency
Mhm.
because most of the
Mhm.
time we will feel those changes depending on how deficient you are pretty readily. But
Yeah.
I had gut issues from being on antibiotics, like I said, for my acne forever. So my gut brain axis was a hot mess. And there were all of these different pieces, but it really took that experience of, I had to weigh, like, I have a breastfeeding baby right now. There's some
Mhm.
pretty significant limitations to, like, there's no way I could do benzos at that time.
Right.
Nor I didn't want to, but it was kind of put me in this unique position of actually really having to explore what are some other options here because this may not be a good fit for where I'm at right now. And so, as far as like a game plan for people, I was on antidepressants at that time, and there's no way I would have been able to go off had I not been addressing like the gut health. We got to get the bacteria where it needs to be. We
Mhm.
got to get the gut brain connection to stop freaking out, get it out of some fight or flight that was going on, get the B vitamins on board, get my adrenal health where it needs to be. And
Mhm.
then once I was feeling really good and I was like, okay, I know now like how to take care of myself, then I was able to slowly wean off with zero issues. zero issues.
Yeah.
And relatively, I mean, I think I might have had like a day where I felt like a little bit off, but it was not at all like what with, weaning had been before. And so that's the game plan that I walk my clients through, and very similar to you, like what do we need to build up in the body so that we can
Mhm.
actually make this a successful and safe transition for you. Um, because it's, in my opinion, it is not safe to just wean off of them even slowly without considering the reasons why your brain doesn't have those chemicals.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's so important. And I mean, if you are going through a period of stress in your life, if you are grieving, if you are just if you know you have a nutrient poor diet and you're not really going to be able to change it anytime soon, it's probably not the right time to
Yeah,
try going off your medication. I
right.
wonder how many people are trying that, even with their physician's approval and trying to wean, but their body is just not ready because of
Right.
life circumstances and that those internal imbalances that are still at play.
Absolutely. And that's where I think, just having that open discussion of the timing and like the different factors, like my mom was on hospice when I was pregnant with my second, and I'm like, this is not, and I was on a
Oh,
super low dose and it was probably placebo, but I was like, this is not the time for me to wean
yeah.
off of this right now. Like,
Hmm.
it's just not. And again, I don't know how much that 10 milligrams was doing anything, but
Hmm.
'cause it was much lower than like even the recommended starting dose. Um, but it is important to pay attention to those different factors. So one of the things I kind of wanted to talk about in here, and because I know we both come from, a Christian background, a faith-based background, different, excuse me, elements of ministry. How do we have some better conversations as pastors, excuse me, as ministers that are helping members of, the body of Christ, to have a more meaningful conversation about mental health? Because I do think that there is still such stigma around it. There's not a lot of room to talk about struggle, or I'm gonna have to like edit this part out, sorry. um, or so the struggle, but also just creating room for the normalization of how our mental health is impacted by different things. So, what are some ways that we can start to have more meaningful conversations around this topic?
Gosh, there's so many directions I could go, but I do think it is important to acknowledge the physical factors at play. It is important to acknowledge that we live in physical bodies that, yes, they can renew, and yes, God can bring healing, but there are so many deficits to work with as well. And I think about, gosh, I was recently reading, and I cannot even tell you what it was, but just reading about Jesus's humanity, right? Like
Mhm.
just being that embodied man on earth. He was sweating blood. He was
Mhm.
sweating blood. Like I've been through some emotional turmoil in my life. I have never sweat blood. Like it's
Right,
never been to that
right.
extent. So
Yeah,
he understands what it means to go through emotional pain that hits physical pain,
yeah,
right? Because they are connected. And I think we sometimes want to separate them, and maybe we put Jesus in that category of like, well, he's just experienced this on the cross, this emotional pain, this emotional separation from God or whatever, and of course, I don't want to get into all this like theology part of it,
right.
but we have to remember he experienced the physical deficiencies of being human as well,
Yes.
to the point where they were touching that. I just think that sweating blood, that was so revolutionary for me to read recently, just going, oh wait, this is the emotional physical connection
Yes.
in the
100%.
Bible right here. And we do have that throughout scripture, even in the Psalms, where David is crying out, and he is in what seems to be physical pain because of what he's going through, whether his own guilt or shame, or
Right.
just his own. David he's such a complex, talk about emotions and complex character, but David is one of those that I'm always rooting for him, but I still kind of think he's a jerk for the whole Bathsheba thing. So,
Right.
and some of the other things. But I read the
Yeah.
Psalms and I'm like, oh, you get me,
Yes.
like I feel
The
seen.
ups and the downs,
And
right?
there are lots of different. Oh yeah. And I think about Joseph waiting and waiting, he interprets that dream and he's like, this is my chance to get out of prison. And then it's
Yep,
years later that he's finally
totally.
out. So we have all of these, we know we have Bible characters, Bible people, real people of the Bible who experienced emotional pain. We also have the physical, and it is connected. I think we want to, in our modern world, separate and put things into categories, and we're
Right.
separating things into physical, mental, and emotional. But we also know that the Bible tells us we are loving God with our whole heart, with
Mhm.
all of our mind, soul, physical strength, right? And
Yes.
so there is that integrated body at play in the Bible, in real life. We know it now more than ever before. I think we have the science to back it up, which I think
Yes.
is really. But the reason I say that is because I think the church could start with not compartmentalizing everything. Let's
Yes.
stop making everything a spiritual issue or everything a physical issue. When it's cancer, it's a physical issue and we're praying it away.
Yep.
When it's depression or anxiety, we're praying it away because it's like an emotional state that we feel like we should fix.
Right.
And I say pray it away. I don't say that lightly. I'm just saying I tried to pray away my depression.
Oh,
And I
100%.
know God is a healer and I know he can heal depression. I just know for me, there were some physical things at play
Absolutely.
that needed to be worked on too. And so that this is where it's just delicate territory, right? Like I want to
Absolutely.
acknowledge God as the healer, but I also want to acknowledge that we are living in a broken world with broken bodies
Right.
that are, hopefully going to be made new
Yes.
sooner rather than later, right? So yeah,
Right.
that's real complicated to talk about. So I hope that made sense.
It did. Well, and I think it's, for me, I know when I was really stuck in that place, postpartum, and prayer was my only tool. It was the only tool that I knew at the time aside from medication. But I still felt so much shame for like, why isn't this leaving? Like, why is it not getting better?
Yeah.
Instead of realizing that God, being a resourcer, right? He had other resources available for me that didn't diminish his healing just because he chose a different path for me. And ultimately, it was that got me out of the medical system, that got me, doing what I'm doing now, um, because of that pain and because of what I walked through there. And it's ultimately what got me into therapy and realizing that there was some very emotional, like things that were locked in emotionally that were causing physical issues in my body. So it ended up bringing a lot of integration, honestly,
Mhm.
to my experience. But I think, when we're one of the best things that we can do for people, I think, is to just become really good listeners of their story. And yes, we can point them in the right direction, but instead of labeling it as you just need to pray more or you just need deliverance, or which, yeah, you might need both of those things. But when you're in crisis, what do you need? You need somebody to attune to you and to make you feel
Mhm.
safe. And
Mhm.
so if that safety means I'll go to the doctor with you, I'll talk to you after your doctor's appointment. I will help you connect to these different resources. You're not alone. I understand.
Mhm.
Like those kind of things can actually really create this foundation for people of security when they're walking through something that's really hard and really scary. And I think about that time of my life as a teenager with OCD. It was extremely scary for me. I was young. I didn't know what was happening to my
Mhm.
body. I didn't
Mhm.
know that. Now I can put some pieces together that, like, oh, that was probably some post-infectious stuff happening to my brain, amongst other things. So I think it is a delicate conversation. And I think the key there is to treat it delicately in the sense of let's treat it with some compassion and some tenderness as ministers or as friends, and just love people where they're at and help them to get to the resources that God might have for them. And that may be prayer, it may be medication, it may be working with you, you know, and really not limiting the hand of God and how he wants to move on people's behalf. And so I feel like there's a lot more we could dive into on that, but really just being open, I think, to the conversation. Um, it would probably bring a lot of healing for people and reduce some of that shame and just allow for a better conversation. But this was really good, really, really good. Is there any last parting words that you want to share with our audience today?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, and this kind of just touches on what you just said, I think that sometimes when we are struggling, it's a really good opportunity to experience the community
Yes,
that God truly is also another important biblical foundation. Like what if we are struggling because we just need to be able to share our pain with somebody else so that
right.
we know that we're not alone.
Yep,
And that's a great first step, and just to understand that it's okay to share, because like you said, sometimes these things can come from very deep wounds that we
hmm,
have locked up and stored away and didn't know were there. And
right.
that's happened to me recently. I've uncovered recently some trauma that was very protective. God designed my body so well that there's trauma I didn't know I had until I was
Right.
41.
Yeah, right. Locked in.
So but now I get to, with what I know and what I've learned, I get to find a counselor who is going to walk me through a healing process. I get to open up to close friends and let them know that I'm struggling, that they can pray for me when the bad stuff is hitting. Right.
Yes,
So I think that, just what a great opportunity to not struggle alone. And I think
absolutely.
so many feel isolated, and we don't have to. And that maybe this is just the way to get to the point where you can share so that you realize you aren't as alone as you might think.
Absolutely. No, that's so good. And looking at it, and I would say this is true for disease, it's true for illness, it's true for mental health issues, is if we can look at it less like an inconvenience and more like an opportunity for healing, then that totally changes how we move through that process, right? It's like, okay, now I can go out and look for resources instead of, oh, this is such an inconvenience. Like, no, what is the level of healing that my body needs or my mind or my emotions need? So I love that you shared that. Would you mind telling people, I'll put it, of course, in the show notes, but telling people how they can find you and work with you if they're interested in that?
Yes, absolutely. So my website is sparkingwholeness.com, and that's sparking, not sparkling, but sparking wholeness, WHOLENESS.com. And then my Instagram is at sparking wholeness, same thing. And then my podcast is sparking wholeness as well. And that's searchable on any platform.
Amazing. Thank you so much for being on with us today, Erin. And I can't wait to have you on again here in the future.
Yeah, thanks for having me.